Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. So it's been a while since I did a Dave Barry book, and I remembered that I have a lot of them and that it had been a while, so Dave Barry. So this is Dave Barry Hits Below the Beltway, written, I assume, in memory of the 2000 presidential election, because the 2000 presidential election in the United States was, well, it was wild. I don't know how many of you may remember this, but I remember that 4 years later, a great many smaller countries that normally have various U.S. inspectors and whatnot hanging around their elections started making wisecracks about how somebody should really send some inspectors to check on the U.S. elections to make sure that those were valid and fair. Because, of course, everybody remembered what happened in the 2000 elections. So Dave Barry Hits Below the Beltway is ultimately a look at the United States government through the filter of Dave Barry's humor. Naturally, the back of the book really has nothing to do with anything besides the implicit joke about hitting below the belt. That is this, where they have him doing that, which we all know what that is, and it's kind of unnecessary, but it's an extra picture, and it's on the back of the book, and it's actually in color, so there you go. So he talks about the ostensible history of, well, human government in general. Yes, look at that. It's $15 in the US and $23 in Canada. That's because the exchange rate between the US and Canada has always been not very good, and it's rare indeed that the exchange rate is in Canada's favor. I think it happened once for about 2 days. Anyways, okay, so growth of the federal government. So I'm really skipping ahead with this one because most of the pictures are this sort of clip art, and this is clearly, even if it's not actual clip art, it's clearly inspired by clip art, you know, as one does. And so the first chapter, I mean, once you get out of acknowledgments and introduction, because you have the acknowledgments where Dave Barry says, you know, thanks to all of the people who proffered him actual facts which he has ignored, and thanks to his so-called research department, Judy Smith, who fights an endless losing battle to make the things I write accurate, or at least less inaccurate. It is a tribute to her character that she has never, to my knowledge, turned to heroin. Anyway, so after the introduction, when he, among other things, points out that nobody outside of Washington cares about policy. This is something actually that you notice when you watch the news. If you ever watch political pundits, they'll sit there and they'll say things like, oh, the people are going to notice this. They'll say, they'll pay attention and they'll worry about this thing. No, they won't. Because what they forget is that ordinary people find politics boring. I find politics boring, and I know enough to know better, but it's still not that interesting, because politics is ultimately a bunch of talking heads talking about policy. And the thing about policy isn't dramatic and exciting unless you do it in the West Wing, where, as Dave Barry points out, it's a very well-written show with a lot of dramatic music and good actors striding around a lot, so it makes policy sound interesting, but policy often boils down to a lot of not very interesting things. You know, the finer points of taxation and the finer points of whether or not somebody should say something to somebody else. Because heavens forfend we actually, you know, do a thing. Then again, you know, political leaders who actually do things tend to be incredibly divisive. See Pierre Elliott Trudeau as example number one, at least where I am. Anyways, so he talks about, you know, the development of human government, which, you know, starts off with human government as the guy with the biggest stick, because we all know that was the first form of human government. Everyone gets together and says, Oog over there is very wise, and then Oog's angry brother, who's very big and has large muscles, wallops Oog over the head with a stone, and everyone says, well then, I guess Oog's brother is going to be the one in charge because we're all scared of him. But eventually, after much time, he gets around to the U.S. government. And this is growth of the federal government, which, if you're wondering, he actually does declare a source. He declares his source to be Alan Greenspan. And so in this, he goes through, the way that the government started off in 1800 as small and got bigger and bigger and bigger because, of course, that's what governments do, because as the problems governments face become more complex, you need more people to handle them. And, these things can wind up becoming exponentially larger, as we see there. Ending, of course, with giant prehistoric zucchini, because as we all know, zucchini will someday take over the earth. That's why they managed to take over everybody's gardens. And then, of course, you have the architectural development of the U.S. Capitol, source American Association of Architectural Historians on crack. Where this is when he talks about how everybody should go to visit the Washington, D.C., or at least Americans should go to visit Washington, D.C., because, of course, it is the center of government, and you should look around and see what your center of government is like. And, the thing about this book is that it's that Dave Barry way of making a point while at the same time being irredeemably silly. Because, of course, he makes a lot of ridiculously silly comments, but at the same time, he points out, in the process of candidates when you have candidates for various political positions, that the candidates and the surprise challengers shall spend the next several months conducting primary campaigns in which they shall heatedly denounce special interests and raise millions of dollars from special interests. Because, we know that. That's a lot of how politics, unfortunately, works, because we do not have mandatorily government-funded things. Instead, we allow people to raise their own money, which means that only really wealthy people can manage to make it in politics, which means, going to rich people, which means special interests. And, of course, the most important facet of this book, that somewhere in every chapter there has to be some giant prehistoric zucchini, because giant prehistoric zucchini are rapacious, and we should be concerned about their constant presence in our lives, and thus we need to have a reminder in every chapter. Eventually, though, after a lot of talking about various issues and side issues and digressions, he gets to what I suspect was the reason behind this book, and that is the 2000 election, where we all remember that it was the South Florida ballot recount that, sank the whole thing. And that whole dimpled Chad, hanging Chad mess where, people were trying to effectively psychically determine whether or not a ballot was spoiled or whether somebody had actually voted a particular way, and counting and recounting. And for the record, a couple of newspapers actually went through with doing the counting properly and checking into it. And apparently, based on their counts, Al Gore should have won, but, it was too late by the time that came out, and Al Gore had bowed out because the country needed to move on with its life. So, he points out that this ballot, a lot of people found confusing, that they looked at it and didn't really know what everything was. And, of course, Haiku Party. Read instructions? Ha! You punched the hole too softly. A Chad dangles now. What he says, of course, is that people were confused by arrows, and that people in South Florida don't understand arrows. And then he makes fun of Miami driving because, well, that's what you do in cities. You make fun of the driving of the people who live there. And so he winds up actually having 2 chapters devoted to this because, among other things, he makes the point that he says, kick Florida, or at least South Florida, out of the Union. And he makes the point that South Florida is irretrievably weird, that there's crabs that live on your front lawn, that there are terrifying reptiles and spiders that live there, that far too many people have exotic pets like emus, and for some reason people will have, like, cougars in their homes because people are lunatics and think that cougars make good pets. Actually, there are a lot of people who think that large carnivorous cats make, well, like, all cats are carnivorous. They think that large hunting cats make good pets. Like, people think that a tiger makes a great pet. And, you know, these are people who I always think, no, I don't want them to die, but I do want the tiger to bite their leg off and then have somebody ask them, do you still think this tiger is an adorable pet? Do you think maybe you should have not purchased this tiger, or if you manage to stumble across it by some alchemy, maybe hand it over to some official group that are, you know, better resourced to raise tigers? You know, he talks about the ridiculous drug trade that goes on down there. This was viewed in the neighborhood as vaguely noteworthy, but not particularly uncommon. The house was simply another neighborhood landmark. The Liebman's house, the Williams's house, the drug dealer's house. My son would ask if he could ride his bike, and I, being a responsible South Florida parent, would say, okay, but don't go beyond the drug dealer's house. So he talks about that. He talks about the ridiculously corrupt mayors and attorneys down there. And he does spend a lot of time making fun of lawyers, which is completely understandable. And I say this as somebody who's been to law school, although there is one objection that I have where he says, you know, that I myself have never been to law school, he says, but I think I know what goes on there. The students are attached to electrodes and examined by their professors in a process something like this. Law professor holding up a spoon. What am I holding in my hand? Student, a spoon. Law professor presses a button. Student, aye! Law professor holding up the spoon. Again, what am I holding in my hand? It looks like a spoon. No, please don't. Law professor presses button. Student screams. Again, what am I holding in my hand? And the student goes on to say, in certain purely superficial respects, it may resemble what is sometimes called a spoon, depending, of course, on the definition of, quote, spoon, unquote. However, we intend to present expert testimony showing that there are a number of other plausible explanations such that it cannot be determined beyond a reasonable doubt that this is a spoon, or for that matter, not a spoon per se, depending on who is paying us $300 an hour plus expenses, nor have we established that legally that is your hand. Correct. Now, that's not what happens in law school. What happens in law school is they tell you you can say absolutely anything as long as it's not actually a lie. And so, if you're standing in front of a court and somebody says, the man who robbed my store is 6 feet tall and your client is 5'10", you can complain bitterly that they totally mistook someone who was 5'10" for someone who was 6 feet tall because a matter of 2 inches is absolutely 100% the difference. It makes such an enormous difference that a person being held at gunpoint will absolutely be able to tell the difference between 5'10" and 6 feet. Which, keeping in mind that 6 feet being 5'12", is, you know, it's a ridiculous point, but a lawyer is allowed to hammer on that point until somebody gets so confused that they think that no, they could never possibly mistake someone who's 5'10" for someone who's 6 feet tall, God knows. And when you're allowed to say absolutely anything so long as it's not actually a lie or actually illegal, it gives you a lot of leeway to say a lot of really, really weird things. Anyway, I'm running out of time, so that'll be everything from this particular book, and I hope somebody enjoyed this, and I will see you all next week.